We now have a PC trailer for Call of Duty Black Ops 7, which is launching November 14th, but we also have the new PC system requirements and some additional information about the game. They are calling out all of the PC-specific optimizations and mentioning FSR4 support, but also the new Ricochet anti-cheat. So that's actually the first thing I want to make sure everybody is aware of, because if you've just been playing previous Call of Duty games on your PC, to my knowledge, now maybe the anti-cheat got updated at some point, so you've already encountered this. I'm going to be honest, I usually play Call of Duty once a year when a new one launches to benchmark it really just benchmark it, to be honest, guys. Anyway, so the Ricochet anti-cheat has now switched over to requiring secure boot and TPM 2.0. Previous versions of the game, when I benchmarked them, that was not the case, so this is a new thing. Now, this is not the only game doing this. Battlefield 6 is requiring secure boot. I think Valorant requires secure boot, and the idea here is to reduce the amount of cheating and hacking going on, and I think they can also then ban, I think, the entire hardware based on the TPM keys. Could be wrong on that, but I think that's the idea behind this. Now, the problem, though, is that I think some older motherboards may not support these features. Also, you can occasionally run into issues trying to turn it on, as I've actually mentioned in a couple of previous videos where I had some issues trying to get this going on a mini PC of mine. Did eventually get it to work. But also, like, if you've installed Windows on a storage partition that's not in the correct format that's compatible with secure boot, that can be a problem. So, in other words, this could be an annoyance for people who have been playing Call of Duty previously, but now this causes some problems. Like I said, it is good to see that we have confirmation of FSR4 support. Anyway, now, an additional piece of information is the release times. So we now have this. So the game launches on November 14th at midnight, right when it ticks over to November 14th as of East Coast United States time, which means if you are on the West Coast of the United States, you can actually get it at 9 p.m. on November 13th. And in other places of the world, you can see the release times here. So there's that information. Now let's get on to the main topic of the video, which is the PC system requirements. Again, note that TPM 2.0 and secure boot are required. So that's important to note. Now, the PC system requirements here, other than that, don't look too crazy. We're seeing an AMD Radeon RX 470, GTX 970, or GTX 1060, or Intel Arc A580 listed for the minimum requirements to play the game. Notice no specific performance numbers promised for that. But for the recommended specs, they're asking for an RX 6600 XT or an RTX 3060 or an Intel Arc B580. Notice the B rather than the A, so that's the newer generation. And notice that they're jumping up from 3 gigabytes of VRAM to 8 gigabytes of VRAM for those recommended settings. The recommended settings are talking about running at 60 FPS in most, but not necessarily all, so there could be dip situations, with all options set to high. Now, again, system RAM, minimum 8, recommended 12. And then the CPUs don't look like anything too crazy here, from a Ryzen 5 1400 or a Core i5 6600 for minimum, and then up to a Ryzen 5 1600X or a Core i7 6700K for recommended. None of those are too crazy, but again, even the recommended here is only targeting 60 FPS with potential dips. For a competitive game, you might be seeking higher frame rates, and while you can turn graphics settings down, on which helps your GPU, that doesn't help the CPU go any faster. So it's possible you will need a faster CPU to get higher, more competitive frame rates. They're mentioning that for competitive higher FPS or for 4K with higher settings, you may want heavier duty systems. It's really the higher frame rates where you're going to want the higher end CPU. The CPU is kind of the limiting factor for high frame rates. If you're willing to turn everything down to the lowest settings, your CPU can still become the limit. They're saying a Ryzen 5 5600X or Core i7 10700K. Now, it's possible that you're watching this video right now and you don't have these exact GPUs, so how can you figure out where your GPU falls relative to this? So I will link this in the video description. This is the Tech PowerUp relative performance chart from their GPU database. And it's important to note that individual games will not necessarily line up to the performance listed here, but this is very good at getting you a rough ballpark figure for how your GPU falls in line with the ones we're discussing here. For example, if we click on the GTX 970, and that sets that as a 100% baseline. So you can tell cards like the RX 470, which were listed as the AMD minimum spec, reaches about 91% of its performance in Tech PowerUp's, testing here, which doesn't necessarily mean that'll be the case in this particular game, but it does show that they're generally in a similar ballpark of performance. There's not a wild performance gap between the two. It also means if you have something like a 1650, you're also not too far off from this general performance tier. Same thing with an RX 6400 or an Intel Arc A380. I think you guys get the idea. If we scroll up the list, we can notice that a GTX 1060, which was also listed as the minimum requirement along with a GTX 970, is also about 9% faster than the 970. So again, in a similar overall performance tier. And notice that they had listed the Intel Arc A580. Are we seeing that yet? Where's the A580? Here we go. That's generally 82% faster than a GTX 970. So that's the one that feels a little bit out of place in this minimum requirement. But notice they're not discussing any particular frame rates here. So what they're probably saying is if you have an Arc GPU that's lower than the A580, maybe they're not recommending you play this game on that. But they're not necessarily saying that the A580 will get the same performance as a 970, 1060, or RX 470. So remember, system requirements charts are not benchmark charts. They're not necessarily saying that these cards perform exactly the same. They're just saying they're the minimum you would need for these respective brands to play the game. That's what they're saying. Notice you do want at least 3 gigabytes of VRAM on whatever GPU you have. This relative performance chart can also be useful for that, but it won't always list every version of a card. For example, the 1060 has a 6 gigabyte version, which is what it's showing here, but there's also a 3 gigabyte version. So you do need to keep in mind the different VRAM versions of some of these cards. Now, how does the recommended spec stack up to the minimum spec? Well, notice that if we go from like a 970 up to a 3060, we can kind of get an idea of what that looks like. So if I keep the 970 as that 100% baseline and we scroll up, again, maybe you'll spot your card here somewhere along the way. We can scroll through a bunch of cards, and if we get up to the 3060, we're noticing that it's 212% of the performance of a GTX 970. Again, ballpark figures from Tech PowerUp, but the general idea is it's about twice as fast. So the difference between the minimum and the recommended is about double the performance. When we're comparing the NVIDIA GPUs that they've listed. The 6600 XT is in a similar ballpark to the 3060, so you can see that these are, neck and neck, not a huge difference here. The 6600 XT is also 8 gigabytes VRAM, whereas the 3060 has 12. So in other words, they're also saying that the high settings should be fine on 8 gigabyte cards. Do note that in this game, the setting presets go from high to very high to extreme. So the high settings are still 2 notches down preset-wise from the highest settings in the game. Now, another interesting piece of information is that I did test out the open beta on an RTX 3060 and a Ryzen 5 5600X. So notice the CPU I was testing was the higher end recommendation here, not this recommended CPU. So I was on a higher CPU, but I was testing out the RTX 3060. Now I tested it out at max settings, so the extreme settings, and I believe I also check that I'm at native resolution, although here I start kicking on DLSS. And I kick it onto the quality settings, and we can go ahead and see what kind of performance we get here. It kind of jumped up to around 70. When I was at native resolution running around, I was closer to 60 FPS, but it did dip below. So in other words, at least on this particular map, each map can perform differently. That's another thing to keep in mind. And like Warzone can perform differently, and there's going to be a single player campaign that could perform differently. So do keep all of that in mind. But I did verify that the recommended GPU was actually near 60 FPS average at extreme settings native, but did dip below. So by going down to the high settings, it's likely that they're 60 FPS or above in most cases seems pretty realistic based on my testing of the open beta. And let's be real here, there's not usually a lot of performance changes with only a month of that development time from the open beta to launch. So I would expect the launch version of the game to perform within reason pretty similarly to what we saw in the open beta. Now, the competitive /4K ultra settings here are saying that, again, the CPU should be a bit higher if you want to chase higher than 60 FPS frame rates. On my 5600X, I did note that it could go notably higher as we turn down graphics settings. Let's see, I think I paired up a higher end GPU with the 5600X at some point. Did I not? Maybe I didn't. But I know I at least turned down graphics settings and used like more aggressive DLSS and things like that. And I think we were able to get higher frame rates, at least up into the 80s, 90s. Again, it can be different based on the map. But the 5600X seems to at least be good for close to 100-ish FPS, but it might be plus or minus depending on the map. And again, you can have even better CPUs for higher frame rates. And again, graphic settings tend to help the GPU performance, but not the CPU performance too much. Now, the GPUs they're suggesting here are 9070 XT, RTX 4080, or RTX 5070. These, again, are all similar ballpark of performance, even if they're not identical performance. So I think that kind of makes sense. Also, if we set the 3060 as now the 100% baseline, we can look at how much more performance we're kind of scaling as we get up to the 4080, 9070 XT, that kind of stuff. So again, maybe you'll spot your GPU in here. So again, 3060 is saying like 60-ish FPS at high settings. Now we could go like, okay, I have a more powerful GPU, so this percentage increase could be thought of as additional performance beyond that 60 FPS. Again, my testing here was at 1080p. They didn't specify a resolution here. So I'm assuming it's 1080p native, but that could also be similar to like 1440p, but with upscaling, or 4K with more aggressive upscaling. So keep in mind, again, that internal rendering resolution is kind of fluid these days. So keep that in mind. So again, as we scroll up, we got to go up quite a ways to get to like the 4080. So we got the 5070 now. That's about doubling the performance of the 3060, a little bit more than doubling it. And then as we get up to the 4080, that's also a bit more powerful than the 5070 that they were listing here. But again, this is not a benchmark chart. It's not saying these cards are going to perform identically. It's just saying that you can run at high FPS in 4K resolution, ultra settings, or higher FPS like for a super high refresh monitor at reduced settings and resolution. That's the idea. So again, I could like set the 5070 as the baseline, and we can see that generally a 4080 would be, maybe 30% faster. But again, they're just kind of giving a rough ballpark. Now, the 9070 XT is usually somewhere in between a 5070 and a 4080. However, I will say that Call of Duty tends to be an AMD favored title, where AMD tends to perform better than typically it does. So like where you're seeing a relative performance chart like this, where, usually a 9070 XT is kind of neck and neck with a 5070 Ti, maybe the 5070 Ti averaging a little bit faster over a wide number of games, whereas actually in Call of Duty, the 9070 XT is usually a bit faster than a 5070 Ti. Maybe almost closer to a 5080. But again, this is just kind of giving you that kind of general ballpark performance tier, so I wouldn't read too much into these all being listed together. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, nothing else too crazy here, other than they are also mentioning that they are really focusing on PC handheld optimization, saying it runs on most Windows-based handhelds, but they have also optimized visuals and performance for on-the-go play, sharper text for smaller screens, smart power, and battery optimization. If we read a little bit further down this page, we actually get a better idea of what that means. So what they're saying is, first of all, they have specifically targeted the ROG Xbox Ally and Xbox Ally X, and not only for performance, but they're also talking about UI legibility and scaling everything for smaller displays. So in other words, they've actually thought about playing this on handheld side screens and made sure that the graphics actually look right, the menus look right, everything on those smaller size screens, in addition to the performance considerations. So I think that's actually pretty interesting and nice to see. I'm hoping that maybe if Xbox kind of pushes for these ROG Ally and Ally X devices to be something that game developers optimize for, I'm hoping that that will actually help just in general the handheld gaming experience on small screens to be something that benefits even if you don't have these specific devices. And that seems to be the case here. All right, that's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you found it useful and or interesting. The game does mention having a built-in benchmark tool once again, like Call of Duty usually does, which would make it easy to run a bunch of benchmarks when the game launches. So if you're interested, let me know and I could run some GPUs through the benchmark tool at a variety of settings and see what we get. Let me know. Hope all of you have an excellent day.